Hi, welcome to the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences. I'm Margaret Levy, and I'm the director, and I'm very glad to welcome you tonight. This is the second of 3 symposia that CASBS, the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences, is holding this year. You can visit our website, which all of you in this room have done, else you wouldn't have been able to register. But for the live stream audience, which we welcome, visit casbs.stanford.edu for information on previous and upcoming symposia. And to learn more about the center, because we do a lot more than these events, as you'll find out if you look at the website. Now, one of the things that maybe a few of you know about me, but most of you do not, is I was on the very first Romper Room, which... The very first. My best friend's father was the producer. So I learned about do-bees and don't-bees. And that's what I'm going to give you right now. Some don't-bees and some do-bees. I'll start with the don'ts. I want to tell you what the event is not. All of you pretty much signed up before there was any news. So you know that this is an academic event. It is not about a current piece of news or a current political situation. And I want to really be clear about that. That's going to affect what the conversation is and what we talk about, and what questions you should ask. I'm going to give you a couple more no's. Sorry to do this, but that's what my job is as Miss Margaret. Please, no photography and no cell phone videoing. It is live streamed. It will be available on the web forever, or as forever as the web is, and then it'll mutate to something else. So you can watch it over and over there. Don't use this opportunity to take pictures. Please do not shout out questions. For the live audience, we'll take questions that you submit on these little cards that you have all found. Thanks, Iris. That you've all found on your seats. Please write your question down, and members of the staff will pick it up and bring it to me to pass up to the front when the question time comes. Questions should be legible. They should be short. And we will not tolerate any questions about the personal lives or experience of any of the 3 panelists, okay? And put your name on them so we know who asked them. Okay, let me do the doobies now and what this event is about and what the positives are. So we've been planning this discussion since August 2018. What we do every year is take advantage of the wonderful fellows who come to the center to spend the academic year, and we develop our symposia out of the specialties and the interests that the fellows have. And luckily this year we have a group of people, scholars, major scholars from multiple disciplines, who've been studying issues of sexual violence, institutional courage, institutional betrayal. And that's what we are going to discuss tonight. Their understandings of these issues as scholars and academics and their findings. The title, as you know, is Betrayal and Courage in the Age of Me Too. And for the streaming audience, obviously you all will know this, but for the streaming audience, I'm going to read what the subject really is and the focus really is. Throughout the past 18 months, tens of thousands of recollections of sexually violent events have emerged across the United States. In many of these accounts, we also have heard numerous stories of institutional betrayal, where college and university administrations, military and church hierarchies, corporate and entertainment industry cultures, and the justice system have failed to support sexual assault survivors, further compounding their trauma. In this public discussion, our panel explores the dire need for institutional courage in the age of Me Too, and delineates the connections between sexual violence and the persistent structural inequality that disproportionately affects women and girls. Our 2 major panelists are both current 2018-19 CASBS fellows here for the academic year. Jennifer Freyd is a professor of psychology at the University of Oregon. She is nationally, I would say internationally renowned scholar, an expert known for her theories of betrayal trauma, institutional betrayal, institutional courage, and DARVO, which she'll explain. She researches these topics in the context of institutional behavior, sexual violence, discrimination on the basis of gender, minority status, and sexual orientation, and also disclosures of abuse. Vanessa Tyson is Associate Professor of Politics at Scripps College. She explores political discourse surrounding sexual assault, corresponding policies, and the unique identities of sexual assault survivors. In her work, she carefully considers the underlying dynamics that affect policy formulation and consequent outcomes in the areas of race, gender, and social justice. She also has extensive experience volunteering in various capacities in the area of sexual violence awareness and prevention. Our moderator is Paul Brest, former dean and still an active professor emeritus at Stanford Law School. He served as the president of the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation from 2000 to 2012. He clerked for Judge Bailey Aldridge of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the First Circuit. That was before he became head of the Hewlett Foundation. And Justice John M. Harlan of the U.S. Supreme Court, and did civil rights litigation with the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund in Mississippi. Paul is a 2018-19 CASBS faculty fellow. He served on the CASBS Board of Directors and was, in fact, its chair when I arrived, and I've worked closely with him for some time. And he himself was a CASBS fellow in 1983-84, and I sat in his office when I became a fellow 10 years later. With that, I turn it over to Paul and the panelists.
Thank you. So it's a pleasure and an honor to be back here to be able to moderate the panel of two very distinguished scholars in their fields. The program is going to be, each one of them will talk for 10, 15 minutes, as long as you like. And then we'll have a bit of a conversation among us and then turn it over to you with your cards for questions you may have. And I think we're beginning with Jennifer.
Well, I'm super honored to be here, and I want to start with some thanks. I want to thank Margaret Levy and CASBS for organizing this event. I think it's an act of institutional courage to be talking about these difficult topics and bringing social science to these issues. I also want to thank my students, current and former, and collaborators. I couldn't have done any of the work I'll be telling you about briefly without them. And I especially want to note how wonderful it's been to interact with other fellows at the center this year, and especially thank the other members of the sexual violence multidisciplinary group, Elizabeth Armstrong, Estelle Friedman, and Vanessa Tyson. I have learned so much from each of you. So we're clearly at a societal moment, but it's not actually a new discovery that sexual violence is vast in its frequency and its impact. In fact, there are decades and decades of research by social science researchers on sexual violence that have been exploring this issue, usually in obscurity. What clearly has changed is something about public awareness about the topic, and it gives us this opportunity to bring to bear these many decades of research on sexual violence to move us forward as we seem ready finally as a society to do something about this problem. And I'm going to tell you about a few tools that my students and I have developed, conceptual tools that are connected with empirical work that I believe might help us. And if there's sort of one take-home message maybe for tonight, it's that the way we respond individually, institutionally, and societally to sexual violence is extremely important. In fact, there's research indicating that the response, the social response to acts of sexual violence is more predictive of how people fare down the road than any details of the violence itself. So I'm going to tell you about 4 concepts. They're betrayal trauma theory, institutional betrayal, DARVO, which is an acronym that I will explain, and institutional courage. So I'll start with betrayal trauma theory. This is a theory that I started to work on more than 25 years ago and actually has some of its roots in the first time I got the incredible privilege of spending a year here and learned a lot from my fellows. Betrayal trauma theory is an approach to understanding traumatic stress that is different from what had been mainstream trauma theory. Mainstream trauma theory was really focusing on the physical, terrifying elements of a traumatic experience. So you might think of natural disasters or violent attacks or car accidents. Betrayal trauma theory focuses on the relational, on the social elements of events and what impact they may have on us. And an event can be both physically terrifying and have a lot of social elements as well. The core idea of betrayal trauma theory is that we encounter a terrible dilemma when people that we depend on or trust or are close to are the people that betray us. And the dilemma works this way. In most circumstances, or many circumstances when we're empowered, it's very good to be acutely sensitive to betrayal. We are a social species to the extreme, and we're all the time making contracts with one another, implicit and explicit. And every time we do that, it has the flavor of, I'll give you this if you give me that. And it is really costly to us if we get cheated upon or betrayed. We either lose something material or social status, and it's costly. So it behooves us to be very sensitive and to take protective action when we get betrayed. At the same time, we are also highly dependent on each other in relationships that are in some sense asymmetric. One person has more power, more resources, and is giving to the other. And this is at its extreme in infancy with a caregiver. That dependency is with us throughout the lifespan in various ways, but it makes us very vulnerable should the person who is taking care of us be the one who is the betrayer. Because in order to maintain a dependency relationship as the receiver, one has to stay engaged and respond in a way that our well-evolved attachment system will work well with, which is to engage and get close. Those responses to betrayal that are useful when we are independent, empowered beings, which is to withdraw or confront, get in the way of the attachment relationship. And this puts us in a bind, a terrible bind, and one way out of it is to actually not see the betrayal. And we started to research this possibility, we call it betrayal blindness now a long time ago, and found quite a bit of evidence that in fact people will respond to betrayal with blindness if it is a survival advantage. And you might stop and reflect for a moment that even now as an empowered adult, think about situations where maybe you are dependent on some other person or some institution, maybe your government, and how you get out of that situation. Well, one way, if that other being is betraying you, is to actually not fully see it. So years of research on betrayal trauma has revealed not only that we are blind to betrayal, but that it is very, very toxic. In studies in which we control for how much physical terror is present as best we can, we find that betrayal predicts all sorts of negative associations, physical, mental, and behavioral. It's very toxic for people. More recently, we've asked the question, can institutions betray? And we've researched the concept of institutional betrayal. And we define institutional betrayal very broadly, which is when institutions a person's dependent upon harms them in some way. This can include the failure to protect when there's a reasonable expectation of protection, such as when a government fails to provide safe drinking water, or a university fails to respond well when somebody's been sexually assaulted within that university. And my students and I have developed measures of institutional betrayal and found that indeed, institutional betrayal, even controlling for interpersonal trauma, is associated with numerous negative harms. It's like, instead of value added, it's like harm added. It's on top of the interpersonal problems that people face. Related to institutional betrayal is how we respond. And I mentioned that response is so important. The ways we respond can be individual, but they can be institutional as well. And my students and I have also conducted many studies on the relationship between people's well-being and the nature of how that people have responded to their disclosures of trauma, especially sexual trauma. And we've developed some educational materials to teach people to become better responders, and basically found what other researchers have found, that response really matters. I don't have time to tell you about all that, but I do want to tell you about one particularly pernicious kind of response, mostly so you can be aware of it and maybe even call it out when you see it. And this is what I refer to as DARVO. DARVO is an acronym. It stands for Deny, Attack, and Reverse Victim and Offender. And this was an acronym I came up with in the 90s, observing what often happens when somebody is being held accountable for a wrongdoing. It was very much displayed during the Anita Hill, Clarence Thomas hearings, for instance. And in DARVO, what happens is there is an aggressive denial followed with an attack on the credibility of the person making the claim. It might take the form of questioning their mental abilities or their motivations, saying you're a liar or you're crazy. And then reverse victim and offender is when the person who's being held accountable assumes the victim role and says, I'm the victim here. And more recently, we've been researching this systematically in the laboratory, and we have found that, unfortunately, DARVO seems to work, and you could say it's like a perpetrator strategy. And the ways we've so far found it works is it's associated with victim self-blame. So if people get DARVO'd, they're more likely to blame themselves. And it's also associated with third-party judgments. So third parties who are exposed to DARVO responses versus non-DARVO responses are more likely to doubt the victim and assume the perpetrator must have some basis for making the claims. The good news is preliminary research in our lab also suggests that education about DARVO helps mitigate a bit, that people who learn about DARVO are less likely to stop believing the victim who's been DARVO'd. And so more research is needed, but in the meantime, I think it would help if we called it out when we saw it. And I want to end with a few words about institutional courage. So institutional courage is a term that I am using to really capture the notion of the antidote to institutional betrayal. Institutions often, despite the well-intention of the people within them, appear to gravitate towards behaviors that are betraying. This means that we need to look at our institutions and figure out how to reform them to keep them from betraying. I think this is a fixable problem. I think it's a matter of identifying where the betrayal is occurring, where we can take actions of courage to counter that and reform our institutions. Recently, I've outlined 10 steps that are research-based for institutions. They include number of things, but I want to just highlight a couple. One is that there is great benefit in doing systematic, regular, scientifically sound anonymous surveys within institutions regarding victimization and discrimination, and also institutional behavior. And these should be done regularly. The results should be shared. It's quite transformative when this occurs. Another thing that's so important is education. I don't mean sexual harassment training where you sit and watch a video. I mean education. In fact, I mean events just like tonight. And this education should occur for all stakeholders and certainly for leaders of organization. It can make a really big difference if people have knowledge and concepts and tools based on research. And then finally, I want to mention that, as I've been saying, response matters so much. We can teach people to respond better, and associated with that, we can do things within our institutions to cherish the truth tellers. So I believe that it's hard to stop sexual violence. It's a big problem. It's going to take a while. And we can't change the past, but we can really, actually rapidly, if we just have the will to do it, we can begin right away to change our institutions, to reduce the institutional betrayal and nurture the institutional courage. Thank you.
So I'm Vanessa. Some of you know me, some of you don't. First, I'd like to thank all of you for being here. And I'd really like to thank Margaret Levy, our visionary leader, who has just been a godsend this entire year. Also, my fellow fellows, because I just adore you all to pieces. And finally, my friends or colleagues, but friends and students back in Claremont, California, because I love them. So thank you. There's a number of things that I want to discuss. So Jennifer is a psychology PhD. She's renowned internationally. I'm a political scientist, but I do look a great deal at identity formation. How do we become who we are? And how does that shape our political attitudes? And I think that there's something to be said for the fact that sexual violence and sexual assault in our lives can have a very prominent impact on our understanding of ourselves, our bodies, the world around us, and whether or not, when and where we choose to enter into it. I have some statistics that I wanted to read simply because I think that statistics are good, and I tend to be a bit more of a number person, by training at least. So these are from the CDC National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey. Right. 19.3% of women and 1.7% of men will be raped in their lifetimes. Right. So almost 20% of women and almost 2% of men are raped in their lifetimes. Of that, right, also 43.9% of women and 23.4% of men experience other forms of sexual violence. I want to be very, very clear here, right? Particularly when you're thinking about women and girls, right? You're looking at roughly 65% of the US population will be raped or victim of some type of sexual assault in their lifetimes. Of the female rape victims, 78.7% were first raped prior to age 25, and 40.4% were first raped prior to age 18. These are just the statistics. I'm going to say it again just in case you forgot. 78.7% of women, female rape victims, were first raped prior to age 25. And 40.4% of female rape victims were first raped prior to age 18. All right. This is drastically shaping how we see and interact with the world around us. I make no mistake. It's an epidemic, so to speak. This is a public health issue. It is not simply a crime issue. It is a public health issue. It is killing us slowly, quickly, but it's killing us. It is taking everything out of ourselves just to function in this world and to try to make it a better place. Sorry. So, this year I've been working with Estelle, Elizabeth, and Jennifer. And one thing we did together was that we had the opportunity to watch Christine Blasey Ford testify here at CASBS, not in Washington, D.C. And we all had varying reactions to it, but it kind of focused around a dynamic of empathy, right? That as she shook, we shook with her. As she told her story, we felt the pain that she so visibly demonstrated. And so I've been playing around with this idea that as survivors, perhaps, one of the dynamics that we're experiencing is this kind of empathetic absorption, right? It's not simply a fatigue, it's understanding the weight that someone else carries. Because maybe in our lives, at some point, one place or another, we've carried that weight too, right? So when we hear someone else's story, there's a beauty in it in the sense that you're not alone. And I think that most survivors suffer from this, this isolation of feeling that, we're alone, that no one will ever believe us, that no one will ever, love us again. And yet we have this empathetic absorption because we see her bravery, we see her strength, we see her vulnerability, and we recognize it, and maybe perhaps it helps us to see it in ourselves. The second thing I'd like to talk about is this idea that I'm working through that will hopefully either be a chapter in a book or a journal article, which is this idea of compounded vulnerabilities and cumulative inequality. Right. So I'm kind of going through, from different disciplines, but with trying to develop an understanding of the ways in which the different types of vulnerabilities may affect us, particularly, should we choose to come forward. Not only that, but, just in terms of whether or not a predator sees us as easy prey, for lack of a better term, right? So compounded vulnerabilities, for those of you who have studied feminism, for those of you who have studied Black feminism, critical race theory, there's this idea, we talk a great amount about intersectionality, right? These intersections of race, of gender, of class, of sexual orientation, of gender identity, of disability, that all of these different identities, for lack of a better term, intersect with each other, right, at different times, and they create unique experiences that we all need to navigate as we make our way through the world. So for me, compounded vulnerabilities has to do, extrapolating from intersectionality, this idea that we each suffer from these unique vulnerabilities. Right? It may be race, it may be class, it may be sexual orientation, it may be your gender identity, it may be your ethnic background, it may be within a dynamic within your religious practice, it could be that you are disabled, right? All of these are vulnerabilities that may lead someone else to identify you as easy prey, as a target, because you can't fight back. Or because you may lack the kind of credibility that comes up so often in the Me Too movement, whether or not they choose to believe us. And I want to say this. On the topic of credibility, it deeply, deeply concerns me that some women who come forward, and some men too, because I want to make clear that men and boys are victims of rape as well. But there's a recurring theme, at least when women come forward, that, this deliberate attempt to try to undermine someone's credibility, right? And also a prioritization or a privileging of women who might come from a higher socioeconomic status. They might come from, maybe a dominant group such as white people. They may come, they may be highly educated. That seems to be a source of credibility from my vantage point. But this is credibility that I think we need to get away from and move away from, because every woman matters. Every survivor matters, regardless of their background, regardless of where they come from, right? That none of us are disposable and dispensable. That in fact, we should be valued for our uniquenesses as human beings. That's what I'd like to see in the world. And so I think about sexual violence more broadly, right? And I think about our society and what we can expect, what we should be able to expect without betrayal, right? And one thing that I notice with sexual violence is that there are many people who would like to glance away from this. And maybe they would do it subconsciously, maybe they do it consciously, maybe it's just too much. And I understand it's one of the ugliest aspects of humanity, trust me. But what and who we glance away from says so much about what our priorities as a society. And it says so much about our health and our emotional well-being, right? Don't be afraid to see survivors for who they are. The beautiful parts, the ugly parts, everything in between. And know that they didn't deserve what happened to them. They have nothing to be ashamed of. And they are not alone. I want to commend Jennifer in particular. She's become my closest friend here, though I love everyone. But I think that your ideas regarding institutional courage are so incredibly profound and so unbelievably important in this time and age. I'm a college professor, right? You can take the professor out of the classroom, but you can't take the classroom out of the professor. And over the years, I've had students survive various forms of sexual violence. I think many professors in the room kind of can empathize with that, right? We want to do what's best for our students. We love our students. And we love the institutions that we're at, right? Where we teach. And so I'm trying to think, along with Jennifer, about the ways that we can help our institutions become more transparent, help our institutions serve everyone, help the institutions develop courage in the sense that we want them to stand up and instead of sweep certain dynamics under the rug, right? And I know that this is kind of a recurring pattern, or at least I've seen this as a recurring pattern, and I hope that will change. And I do believe that Jennifer is one of the people who would change it. And it's just such a delight to be your friend. Thank you.
I feel the same way.
So these are rich, powerful, and appropriate for CASBS, very interdisciplinary presentations. Something that Margaret has intensified, I guess fair enough to say she brought it to CASBS, is a very strong link between behavioral science and public policy and social practices. So I have two questions. My first one is, if you had, and let's focus on colleges and universities, which are by no means the only locus of institutional betrayal and other problems, but are certainly a major locus, and certainly for both of you. If you were to make one policy recommendation for changing the practices of, take either colleges in general or a particular university, to address the problems of sexual violence that you described, what would they be?
That's hard. That's like, what's your favorite color? I have to start with...
You can have two.
Okay. Okay, good, because that's really hard. But I think we're stuck if we don't do the data collection and sharing. Because this is what happens. People say there's a problem out there, but not here. I hear this all the time. There was a survey of university presidents a few years back where they were asked if they thought there was a problem with sexual assault on college campuses, and they said yes. And they were asked, do you have the problem on your campus? And they said no. And we all do this, right? It's not in my family. It's not in my organization. But the problem is that belief is extremely problematic for fixing the problem. So you have to see the problem. And we do have the tools now to measure victimization, really good tools. And the marvelous thing about human beings is if they believe that they are completing an anonymous survey, they tell researchers all sorts of things. So this can be done if it's done in a scientifically sound way. So I just have to say you have to start there, because otherwise nothing else will follow. But then I would say that the next step would be education about responding well, teaching people how just at a human level and an organizational level, how do you respond when somebody raises a difficult experience with you, such that you don't shut down the conversation, such that you don't harm that person further?
Has any institution done that well, or at least the beginning of something one could model?
I don't, probably, but I haven't found an institution which I can say has done it well enough that I can hold it up as a model. But I do have particular examples of acts of institutional courage, and certainly a lot of institutions have started to do the systematic data collection. It's really started to happen, and so that's really marvelous. And I've certainly seen acts of enormous courage within institutional contexts.
Could you just give one example before we turn to Vanessa?
Sure. Well, so this is an example I know some of you have heard because I recognize some faces here, and this is an example I find very inspiring, so I tell people about this. I'm, as mentioned, based at the University of Oregon. It's in Eugene, Oregon, an idyllic town in Oregon. About 45 miles away is another idyllic town in Oregon called Corvallis with Oregon State University. And this story is about something that happened at Oregon State University. In 1998, there was a woman named Brenda Tracy who reported to the police and the university that she'd been gang raped. And among the assailants that she named were some football players. And it was responded to terribly on all levels, the police, the prosecutor, and the university. The football players had like a game suspension or something, and nobody from the university talked to Brenda Tracy about her experience, and that was in 1998. So that was institutional betrayal with many institutions. She went on with her life as best she could, but she suffered. It was really difficult. She went through a very difficult experience. By 2014, there was a national discussion about college sexual assault. It was everywhere. The Obama administration created a task force to address college sexual assault, which is amazing, and that followed on the heels of student grassroots organizing. Well, everyone was talking about it, and it was on covers of magazines. And so Brenda Tracy, understandably, began to question what had happened and why had her case been so horribly handled. And then she had the brave decision to call the university and ask them what had happened. And she got blown off at first, but she had an opportunity to tell a sports columnist about what happened. He wrote a column, and it got published in Portland's and Oregon's main newspaper called The Oregonian. It's a beloved columnist, so a lot of people read it. And the day it was published, I'm sure many, many copies were forwarded to the University of Oregon president. And he did not do what most university presidents seem to do in this situation. He did not immediately circle the wagons and figure out how to manage the risk and manage the liability and protect the brand and all the things people rush to do. Instead, he ordered an investigation, and he told them to do it fast. Within 3 weeks, he had the results of the investigation, and he wrote an apology letter to Brenda Tracy, an actual apology letter on university letterhead, and it was very beautifully written. And I'm sure his lawyers told him not to do it. I'm sure they did, but he did it because he was a leader. And he probably said, thank you, lawyers, you're doing your job and telling me there's a risk, and I'm going to do my job and do the right thing. And he did it, and he didn't stop there. He hired Brenda Tracy as his consultant, and for 2 years they worked together and made many changes and lobbied the state legislature to make changes. Brenda Tracy is an incredible hero. She went on, after working in this capacity for a couple of years, to be going all over the country. I'm sure she's on an airplane right now or talking to a football group, because she goes around and she talks to football coaches and football players about changing things. So to me, the president and Brenda Tracy showed great courage, and I would call what the president did institutional courage because of his position and how he got the whole university around. In the end, I don't think he ever did this for PR, but in the end, it actually brought good PR. So that's an example.
Before turning to Vanessa, I just have to say on behalf of lawyers, and I see 3 lawyers connected with universities in the second row. Lawyers don't always tell institutions not to do something. Vanessa, how about your ideas of several policy recommendations?
On a personal level, I think it's very hard for professors to have to be in the position of being mandatory reporters, which we are, at least here in California. And Estelle, Elizabeth, and I and Jennifer have talked about this a great deal. When we think about how to support survivors who are already traumatized, right, who have already, suffered this horrible violation, do we then tell them, okay, you have to call our Title IX officer right away? Right. And by the way, I'm going to call our Title IX officer. This becomes difficult. And I understand both sides of the issue, but I also know that, and I've been in the position as a professor, that sometimes your students come to you because you're the only person that they can turn to. You're the only person that they trust. And this is particularly because I teach at a women's college, and I teach women in public policy, right? And in my courses, we talk about sexual violence. We also talk about paycheck fairness. We also talk about equal pay. I mean, this is part and parcel of not only what I'm teaching, but also the role that I find myself in on an interpersonal level. If a student comes to you as a survivor, they may not realize that their professor is a mandatory reporter who has to report this to our Title IX, compliance officer. And in so doing, right, in essence, I found myself in this particular situation where, do you betray their wishes, right? Someone who's already been violated, who is already traumatized, do you, therefore take any control that they have left out of their hands? It's something that I grapple with, and you, as many professors may know, we grapple with this. When someone confides in you as a survivor, do you stop being a professor? Do you cease being a professor? Can you start being their friend who is trying to create a safe space, right? Part of this idea of institutional courage is the idea that is the hope that you're going to create a space, an environment where abuses of power aren't tolerated. right? This is so incredibly important because there are so many abuses of power that happen in college campuses, in workplace environments, and so on and so forth, right? Academia itself is pretty hierarchical. We could, probably talk for days about that. But in so doing, right, we know that survivors aren't in a position of power. And what little control they have left, do we take that from them? Do we betray their confidence? I understand the reasoning behind behind reporting a number, or an incident, an anonymous incident. I don't know that to have to report their name, I guess, denies them control that they might otherwise have.
So that's an area where university policy at least needs to think about that issue and respond to it. Well, thank you. So a second set of questions, and then second set of questions, is back to the link between social science and policy. Almost every policy has some unanticipated and unintended negative consequences. Are there any major concerns you would have about unintended consequences about existing or likely advocated policies for dealing with sexual violence?
Well, I think I just told you one.
Right. That's quite right.
Yeah, I think we also, have struggled in this country a lot in higher education with figuring out what to do when let's say somebody does want to come forward and report a sexual violation, what to do next in terms of justice and helping them. And I think we've seen that policies on how to, say, bring justice have often really not worked out very well. We've not seen that our criminal justice system, for instance, has a very good track record with handling sexual victimization. And so far, universities have struggled as well. So even policies made with the very best of intentions don't necessarily work.
I would still go back to the mandatory reporting. In terms of unintended consequences, I'm guessing that there's a long list, right? We've seen this kind of evolution of our society, right? On the one hand, you had the beauty that is women's liberation and everything that has had to offer. And yet at the same time, I'm not sure if people focused enough on bodily autonomy, right? And this is the thing, I remember in the 90s that people were talking about no means no, and that continued into the 2000s, but we never really talked about that only yes means yes. Right? That if she doesn't say yes, or if there's no, how do we define consent? And following that kind of how do we understand affirmative interactions as opposed to, you have to fight someone off. You have to scream at the top of your lungs. You have to, that perhaps we need to to reshape how we understand consent, and how we teach it to students, how we how we teach it to society as a whole. And really, I would say in many cases that needs to start in junior high and high school, because if the numbers say anything, the stats that I gave you, it's that by the time we get to college, we're too late.
So one last question for the two of you before we turn to the cards from the audience. You two know each other very well, have become very good colleagues. But based on the conversation you've just had or other things, do you have any questions for each other?
Well, we hike a lot together. And so we kind of hash out all our questions, usually while walking, because exercise, fresh air and sunshine begets good questions, in my opinion. I don't know.
Anything you haven't hashed out that you want to hash out in front of this group?
Yes, in front of the audience. Lovely.
I'm drawing a blank. I'll wake up at 3 in the morning and think of something.
But then we can ask each other. We're going to be friends for the rest of our lives.
Okay. Well, so I will take the first card that Estelle or Margaret will give me. Your handwriting may be great, but my reading is not so good. But it's like, how do we talk about the difference between minor, less severe, nonviolent acts of non-consensual sexual contact and acts of coercive sexual assault?
Can you say the beginning?
How do we talk about the difference between, on the one hand, minor, less severe, nonviolent acts of non-consensual sexual contact and acts of coercive sexual assault?
Should I say?
Go ahead.
So, the sexual violence, which, by the way, for researchers, is an umbrella term that includes sexual assault, sexual harassment, and other gender-based kinds of interpersonal violations. It's a huge range of contexts and behaviors, but I think we often are mistaken about what makes something most, quote, severe. People go back to that physical notion of what's problematic. In fact, sexual abuse that occurs in the context of a close relationship with grooming, so that no violent coercion never gets used, can lead to some of the most long-lasting difficulties people have. Similarly, as adults in the workplace, we can be very harmed by non-contact sexual violence. So workplace harassment can be really devastating for people. The very nature of the question kind of maybe would make it sound like there's kind of less severe and more severe that has to do with how much violence or how physical it is. But psychologically, that doesn't really map. Legally, maybe it does, but not psychologically. So it's very, very contextual. How much somebody is impacted by a particular event is going to depend on their relationship with the person, their past history, and all sorts of other factors. And we need to be, I think we need to be just looking at the whole spectrum as problematic and not really trying to rank order things per se.
I would just reiterate what Jennifer says. Yes, there's a range of behaviors, but I can tell you, that unwanted sexual contact in whatever way, shape, or form is absolutely unacceptable, right? And I want to make this very clear. Now I know there's legal differentiation, and I understand that, and it does make sense. And yet, the amount of violation and the lack of respect of somebody else's autonomy is very crucial. Now, this may depend upon the person who is on the receiving end, as Jennifer said, in terms of any kind of contextual analysis of a situation. I think there's a difficulty, at least in some of the research that I've read, which is that men are more likely to perceive friendliness as sexual interest. As warmth as sexual interest, right? And what does that mean, when we're dealing with these dynamics of consent? And where does that lead, even in terms of whether someone's groping you versus, whether someone may actually be penetrating you? I would argue that legally there is and should be a delineation, but none of it is acceptable. And when we witness it, and we may witness it in our day-to-day lives. Maybe you're at a party. I don't really party anymore, but but for people who do, right? You may see it. You may see something like this happen. You may see someone taking advantage of somebody else who is drunk, right? And might not be unable to consent. And yet, I think as we should step in. Right? That someone who isn't in the position to consent, someone who has not, deliberately invited this kind of interaction, we need to stand by them. So legal delineation, I respect it, but more importantly, I'm concerned about what we do in society and individual courage, not just institutional courage. We can all make a difference just simply by saying no. Even when when we're younger, I think from what I've seen and what I've experienced, that may seem hard for certain people. But it's okay to say no. It's okay to be the killjoy. I've been the killjoy. You just got to do it.
It sounds like the distinction you're making is analogous to homicide. That is, somebody's dead, whether it was manslaughter or murder, first-degree murder or second-degree murder, but they're still dead. On the other hand, you may treat the perpetrator differently based on their intentions and perceptions. Is that essentially the distinction? Because when you say that there's a legal
No, that's actually not the distinction I would want to make. And here's the deal. And I understand that I'm not saying that intentions don't matter, but I'm saying that outcomes matter more, right? That how women are treated or how individuals are treated and respect for their bodily autonomy must be adhered to at all times. And I'm saying this as someone who loves giving hugs, right? My mom loved giving me hugs as a child. I love hugs. But that doesn't mean that I can just that gives me license to just run around hugging people against their will. That my intentions may be good, but I have to respect other people and what they want. And if I forget and accidentally hug you, it's my job. It's on me to apologize and try to make it right.
Got it.
Can I just also push back a little on the idea that the legal definitions of severity capture sort of the psychological reality. So if we all know that the myth of the believable rape is some stranger jumping out from behind a bush and using force and coercion to rape somebody, and I think that's the kind of case that has, if any case is going to make it in the American legal system through, it's that kind of case. Even that one has a trouble, but it has the best shot. And yet, psychologically, a father who grooms his child carefully and over time such that he can violate the sexual autonomy of that child, even without penetration, it might not involve penetration, may do much more long-lasting damage than the bushy stranger behind the bush. So it's just a misalignment, I would say, between our legal understanding of violation and the human reality of where people get hurt.
So let me just come back to, if you're designing a policy for a university, which is to some extent bound by external legal standards, but to a fair amount can have its own standards, would you treat, to go back to the language of this question, minor, less severe nonviolence acts of non-consensual sexual contact and acts of coercive sexual assault, if you were a university, would you treat them with equal severity in terms of punishing the perpetrator?
I don't know that I want to answer in terms of punishing the perpetrator, because I think that leads us in an unfortunate direction. I want to say I would treat them as equally important from the prevention perspective. Mm-hmm. We don't have time tonight to talk about issues, I guess, such as punishment and the nature of our justice system. But I do worry that our focus on punishment and adjudication and so on is often in the way of our fixing this problem. That so much of what happens, it's outside of that realm. It's not going to be fixed by punishing people. It's going to be fixed by creating a society where we can talk about these issues, educate people, raise our children so that future generations are not behaving in this way. Mm-hmm. And we're not going to get a lot of traction from punishing people, and sometimes it's even counterproductive.
That's a very profound comment. Yes.
I think I'd like to add to that in terms of just an issue of mental health, which is campus mental health centers there aren't enough resources for the needs of students from what I've seen, and this is multiple universities, colleges across the country. One of the biggest places where I really wish that colleges and universities would make strides would be to increase the access to mental health, here's the thing. You have so many students, coming into college, right, who likely already have had some form of violence or assault, right? And, you have, a likelihood that this happens as well on college campuses, right? There are any number of maladies that are facing these students as they try to get good grades, and they've made it so far, but they need more support. I know that I hear time and time again about the students are so needy, or the helicopter parents, blah blah blah, right? The position of being a professor. But what I want to say is that these students are coming of age in a world where there's so much gun violence, where there's so much, violence of all different capacities, right? How do we help them? And part of this is, not only attending to their physical health, right, but also attending to their emotional health so that they can grow into confident, loving adults, intellectual adults. Yeah. I just want to say that.
Thank you. So, two related questions about Darvo. When responding to Darvo, and particularly to attacks on victims, is it better to try and disprove the smears of the victim's character, or are we validating this behavior by engaging with it? And then what's the best psychological judo counter-offensive to Darvo?
Those are good questions. So we definitely need more research on Darvo, and I guess this is a good moment to put in a plug that we need so much more research. I'm very proud of what social science has accomplished in the realm of sexual violence, and very glad that we're finally getting a chance to share that. But we also are way underfunded, underinvested in, given the magnitude of the problems. So the research on Darvo is just beginning, and I'm at risk of going way beyond the data, but we really need more. But for now, the one thing I feel fairly confident in recommending is identifying it when we see it. So if we see a victim's credibility being attacked, we can point it out. It can even be pointed out without judgment. Just point out that that's what's going on. That when you say somebody has memory problems or they're a liar, that you are attacking their credibility. And when we see somebody take the victim role in particular, point it out. It happens really fast, and it's like a kind of gaslighting, because it confuses you as to what's going on. So there may be other ways to intervene that we will discover. For now, it's just the call it out that I would recommend.
So even though you didn't trademark the concept, do you have any, how would you respond to the questions?
I again, echo what Jennifer said. Call it out when you see it. You know, it's pretty easy to spot once you know the terminology, right? It's when you don't know the terminology that you kind of just, you follow the tennis match back and forth and back and forth. Oh, you rebound, whatever, right? And this is the problem, because I think in many cases that will actually empower perpetrators, right? Like, no, I'm the victim. Well, maybe no, you're not. Like, like we are taking the tennis ball away. And there's something to be said for when you identify it. Then it's better, it's easier to spot over and over again as a pattern of manipulation. And I would say this, not only with regards to sexual violence, but also with regards to kind of racial manipulation. There are so many different ways in which I think it's incredibly important for an American public to try to identify manipulation as it occurs, as opposed to simply watching and kind of reacting and seeing what's going to happen next. But really trying to deconstruct the power dynamics that are taking place and the manipulations of that power that are so problematically used to abuse those who have less power.
I want to just emphasize something you said that I think is really important. When we get into a debate about, as a society or in a more local way, about what happened, there's somebody said they had this experience, and somebody else said, no, I didn't have that experience, and everybody else is arguing about what happened, when perhaps they just can't know. Perhaps they're not going to know. So as long as they're debating what happened, they may be missing what they can know, what's right in front of them, which is this power dynamic. So for the benefit of argument, we could say during the recent hearings that we could not know what occurred on some night in the 1980s. Some of us may have had an opinion about what happened, but in some epistemological sense, maybe we couldn't know. We could know what was going on right in front of us. We could analyze that. We could say, is this behavior acceptable? Is this involving a power abuse? And hold people accountable for what we can see. This is getting back to the response matters. Mm-hmm. And if we keep on what we can know, I think we're going to do a lot better than get stuck on what we can't know.
So I have two questions which may or may not be related. Let's just do them both at once. One is, how do you change institutional policy to shift the burden of reporting and accountability away from the survivors? And the other, in which law rears its ugly head again, how can we change and inspire courage in women and girls to speak up when the justice system slaps offenders on the wrist?
Well, they're great questions and almost like two sides or something. So I think it's really important we don't ever put the responsibility of fixing a problem on the backs of victims. So many people in our society are, in fact, though, victims of some form of interpersonal violence that actually most of us are. And so in that sense, we're going to have to sometimes take responsibility, even if we've encountered these events at a societal level. But I really worry about ever putting people under pressure to speak up about their own personal experiences. I really worry about I mean, it relates to the mandatory reporting problem. Whenever people lose control over their own privacy or their own autonomy. On the other hand, some people do want to speak out and would like to live in a world where they could. People can really benefit from sharing what happened to them. And here's where we have this shared responsibility to make it possible to have those discussions, to be educated about how to respond well, to make it safe to have those discussions. And that is just really something we can all be doing, that we can all be contributing to that safety by educating ourselves. And as Vanessa said, speaking out when we see something happening that's not right.
I think another thing that I would say is that, speaking as a professor at a women's college, sometimes you have to lead by example, no matter how hard it is.
Has Me Too moved the needle in creating a safe space for the survivors of sexual assault?
Has it moved the needle? Is that the question?
Right.
I mean, I see Me Too as one more piece of a great big social awareness emergence. And maybe just because I've been in the field a long time and I've been tracking and I've seen this happen and that happen. And some of you may remember the year 2000 when the Boston Globe did their now famous from a movie Spotlight expose. And that was an important piece. And I mean, it goes back before that, to Professor McKinnon, who's in the room with us. We're graced by bringing sexual harassment to people's awareness. I mean, each of these was a piece of this amazing transformation. And so Me Too's very important, and it's part of the needle moving. But it's like cause and effect. I couldn't pull one apart from the other. I just hope, because there is a risk, I just hope we don't slide back. And there is that risk. Judy Herman, who's probably the single most famous trauma theorist, I should say, has written eloquently about how we have awareness and then slipping into an abyss of forgetting. Trauma can be remembered and forgotten, and that can happen at the individual and the societal level. It seems like we've been really, really going up the awareness ladder, and I hope we've passed the point of no return. But and I'm cautiously optimistic, but I remain alert for the suppression as well, that we make sure the needle doesn't fall back.
And I think I'd like to add to that, I remember, so one of the former directors of CASBS is a man named Doug McAdam, and he writes about cognitive liberation, right? And the cognitive liberation in this that occurred in the civil rights movement, right? And as more and more Black people understood, like, this is, not only is it not fair, I think that was pretty unanimously understood, but we can do something about this together. And I think that with Me Too, that's what we're seeing, right? That it's this cognitive liberation of sexual assault survivors who are saying, the hardest part of this whole dynamic is that you're made to feel alone. You're isolated. You think that you can't tell anybody. But when women and when survivors more broadly start comparing notes, right? That's when there's the light bulb goes off. Of this has been happening to everybody, and that's, I think, the most important part of Me Too. Right? This was started by Tarana Burke. It didn't just happen yesterday, but yet, it had to take off in like kind of a larger mainstream before everybody started comparing notes. Catherine McKinnon in a recent article I believe the New York Times last week talked about how, on average, it would take 3 or 4 women to come forward before a perpetrator would be held accountable for his actions. And Me Too is kind of is bringing about those 3 or 4 women, those 3 or 4 victims in a way that I think the law can't seem to do.
So I wish we have lots more questions and no more time because the live streaming stops immediately. One last point, there's a resource at Stanford, sexual violence support, .stanford.edu, for anybody who wants more information or support. And then I just have to read you a question, which I hope whoever asked it will contact these wonderful scholars afterwards. What advice do you have for scholars dealing with sexual violence in their scholarship at the beginning of their careers? I wish we had asked that question 15 minutes ago because I think it's a 15-minute answer. But thank you both for your courage. And